The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty desert town of Mesa Ridge, its rays creating waves of heat that danced across the cracked earth. Jack Morrison pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face as his horse Thunder picked its way carefully down the main street. The town looked like many others he'd passed through in his years of wandering. Wooden buildings bleached gray by the relentless sun, a saloon with bat-wing doors that creaked in the hot wind, and a general store with dust-covered windows. But something was different about Mesa Ridge today. Jack could feel it in the air, thick with tension that had nothing to do with the heat. Groups of men stood in clusters, whispering among themselves and casting nervous glances toward the center of town. Women hurried along the wooden sidewalks with their heads down, clutching their children close. Even the dogs seemed to sense trouble, slinking into whatever shade they could find. Thunder's hooves echoed hollowly on the hard-packed dirt as Jack rode deeper into town. He'd been traveling for 3 days without seeing another soul, living off jerky and water from his canteen. The promise of a hot meal and a soft bed had drawn him to Mesa Ridge, but now he wondered if he should have kept riding. As he neared the town square, Jack heard voices raised in argument. He guided Thunder around the corner and stopped short at what he saw. In the center of the square stood a makeshift gallows, its rough wooden beam stark against the blue sky. 2 nooses hung from the crossbeam, swaying slightly in the desert breeze. Below them a crowd had gathered, their faces a mix of curiosity, fear, and something darker. Jack dismounted and tied Thunder to a hitching post outside the saloon. He'd seen enough hangings in his time, most of them justified, some not. But something about this one felt wrong. The crowd was too quiet, too nervous. Good people didn't act this way when justice was being served. He pushed through the bat-wing doors of the saloon, his spurs jingling softly against the worn wooden floor. The interior was dim and cool, a welcome relief from the blazing sun outside. A handful of men sat at scattered tables, nursing whiskey and speaking in low voices. The bartender, a heavy-set man with graying hair, looked up as Jack approached. "What'll it be, stranger?" the bartender asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Whiskey," Jack replied, placing a silver coin on the scarred wooden bar. "And some information if you're willing to share it." The bartender poured the drink and slid it across the bar, but his eyes remained wary. "Depends on what you want to know." Jack took a sip of the whiskey, feeling it burn pleasantly down his throat. "That gallows out there. Who's it for?" The conversation in the saloon died away, and Jack could feel every eye in the place turned toward him. The bartender glanced nervously at the other patrons before leaning closer to Jack. "2 Apache girls," he said quietly. "Sisters, they say. Caught them stealing horses from the Broken Arrow Ranch about a week ago." Jack frowned. Horse stealing was a hanging offense, that was true enough. But something in the bartender's voice suggested there was more to the story. "They confessed to it?" "That's the thing," the bartender said, his voice dropping even lower. "They don't speak much English, and nobody around here speaks Apache. Sheriff Walker says they confessed, but—" He shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes. "But you don't believe him," Jack finished. The bartender straightened up quickly, casting another nervous glance around the saloon. "I didn't say that. Sheriff Walker's word is law around here." Jack drained his whiskey and placed another coin on the bar. "Tell me about Sheriff Walker." "Came to town about 6 months ago," the bartender said, pocketing the coin quickly. "Cleaned up the place, got rid of the troublemakers. We're grateful to him, don't get me wrong, but, well, he's got some strange ideas about Indians. Says they're all thieves and murderers, can't be trusted, and he's got men working for him who feel the same way. Some folks think he's being a bit too quick with his justice when it comes to the Apache." Jack nodded, filing the information away. He'd known men like Walker before. Men who saw the world in simple terms of black and white, us and them. Such men could be dangerous when they had power. "When's the hanging?" he asked. "Tomorrow at noon," the bartender replied. Sheriff Walker wanted to do it today, but Judge Harrison insisted on following proper procedure. 24 hours notice, he said. Jack thanked the bartender and walked back outside, squinting against the bright sunlight. The crowd around the gallows had grown larger, and he could see a man in a sheriff's badge addressing them from a wooden platform. Sheriff Walker was a tall, thin man with cold blue eyes and a mustache that was waxed to sharp points. His voice carried clearly across the square as he spoke about justice and the need to protect honest citizens from savage criminals. But Jack wasn't listening to Walker's words. Instead, he was studying the man's face, the faces of his deputies and the reaction of the crowd. What he saw confirmed his suspicions. This wasn't about justice. This was about something else entirely. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and red, Jack made his way to the jail. It was a small building made of adobe bricks with barred windows and a heavy wooden door. A deputy sat on a chair outside, a rifle across his knees. The man looked up as Jack approached. "Help you with something, mister?" the deputy asked, his hand moving closer to his rifle. "Just wondering if I could get a look at the prisoners," Jack said casually. "Haven't seen any Apache up close before." The deputy's eyes narrowed. "Sheriff Walker don't allow visitors. Orders are orders." Jack nodded and walked away, but not before he caught a glimpse of movement behind the barred windows. Two figures sat in the shadows of the jail cell, and even in the dim light he could see they were young, little more than children, really. Whatever they had or hadn't done, they didn't deserve to hang. As night fell over Mesa Ridge, Jack sat on the porch of the boarding house where he'd taken a room, smoking a cigarette and thinking. Tomorrow, 2 young Apache women would hang, and he had a feeling their deaths would serve someone's purpose beyond simple justice. The question was, what was that purpose and what could one wandering man do to stop it? The moon hung like a silver coin in the star-filled desert sky as Jack Morrison crept through the shadows behind the jail. He'd spent hours planning this rescue, studying the layout of the town, the habits of the guards, and the best escape routes. The deputy who'd been watching the jail had been replaced by another man around midnight, and this one had already dozed off in his chair, his rifle resting loosely in his lap. Jack moved silently, his years of experience serving him well. He'd learned to walk without sound during his time scouting for the army, a skill that had saved his life more than once. The adobe walls of the jail were thick, but he'd noticed earlier that one of the windows had loose mortar around the bars. With patience and the right tools, he might be able to work them free. From his saddlebags, Jack pulled out a small crowbar and a piece of cloth to muffle any sound. He worked carefully, prying at the mortar around the iron bars. The old adobe crumbled slowly, each piece falling silently onto the cloth he'd spread below. It took nearly an hour, but finally the first bar came loose. Through the gap, he could see into the cell. 2 young Apache women sat huddled together on a straw mattress, their dark eyes wide with fear and confusion. They couldn't have been more than 17 or 18 years old, with long black hair and the proud bearing of their people despite their circumstances. When they saw Jack's face at the window, they pressed back against the far wall of the cell. "Easy," Jack whispered in what little Apache he knew. "Friend. Help." The older of the 2 sisters stepped forward cautiously. She had intelligent eyes and a scar on her left cheek that spoke of hard times. In broken English, she said, "You help us?" Jack nodded and continued working on the second bar. "What are your names?" he whispered. "I am Ayana," the older sister replied. "This is Nayeli. We not steal horses. They lie." "I believe you," Jack said, working the second bar loose. "But we need to get out of here before they discover you're gone." The third bar proved more stubborn, but finally came free with a soft grinding sound. The opening was just large enough for the young women to squeeze through. Jack helped Ayana out first, then Nayeli. Both were barefoot and dressed in simple cotton dresses that had seen better days. "Stay close and stay quiet," Jack whispered, leading them through the shadows toward where he'd hidden Thunder and 2 other horses he'd borrowed from the livery stable. He'd left money for their use, but he doubted the stable owner would see it that way if they were caught. They were halfway to the horses when a voice cut through the night air. "Hey, who's there?" The sleeping deputy had awakened and noticed something was wrong. Jack cursed under his breath as the man's shouts began to rouse the town. Lights appeared in windows and he could hear boots running on wooden sidewalks. "This way, quickly," Jack said, abandoning stealth for speed. They ran through the desert scrub, thorns catching at their clothes and bare feet. Behind them, the town was coming alive with angry voices and the sound of horses being saddled. Jack boosted both women onto their horses and swung up onto Thunder. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Ayana replied, gripping the reins with determination. They spurred their horses into a gallop, racing away from Mesa Ridge as the first search party emerged from the town. The desert stretched out before them, silver-white in the moonlight, offering both concealment and danger. Jack knew the country well enough to avoid the worst of the rough terrain, but their pursuers knew it too. For 3 hours they rode hard across the desert floor, Weaving between sagebrush and jumping dry creek beds, Thunder was strong and sure-footed, but the other horses were already showing signs of exhaustion. Jack called for a halt in the shelter of a small canyon where a spring provided fresh water. "We can't keep running like this," he told the sisters as they let their horses drink. "Those horses won't last much longer, and Sheriff Walker knows this country." Ayanna nodded, her face grim. "There is a place," she said slowly. "Sacred place of our people. Hidden cave in the red rocks. 2 days' ride north. Will your people be there?" Jack asked. "Perhaps. The old ones sometimes come to pray." It was their best chance. Jack knew that even if they found no one at the sacred site, the caves would provide shelter and concealment while they planned their next move. But first, they needed to stay ahead of Walker's men. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, they could see dust clouds in the distance. The sheriff and his posse were following their trail, and they were gaining ground. Jack made a quick decision. "Ayanna, take Nayeli and head north toward those red cliffs," he said, pointing to a line of sandstone formations on the horizon. "I'll try to lead them away." "No," Ayanna said firmly. "You saved us. We stay together." "If they catch all of us, we're all dead," Jack replied. "This way, at least you have a chance." But Ayanna had already dismounted and was gathering rocks from the canyon floor. "We make stand here," she said, "like our warrior ancestors." Jack looked at her determined face and realized she wouldn't be swayed. These weren't helpless victims, they were proud Apache women who'd rather fight than run. He nodded and began checking his weapons. The posse arrived an hour later, 8 men led by Sheriff Walker himself. They approached the canyon cautiously, having learned to respect Jack's skill during the night-long chase. Walker called out from beyond rifle range, "Morrison! You're surrounded. Send out those murdering thieves and you can ride away." "They're innocent," Jack shouted back. "And you know it. Horse thieves hang. That's the law." Jack's rifle spoke, sending a bullet that kicked up dirt near Walker's horse. The sheriff's men scattered for cover among the rocks. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted most of the morning. Neither side could gain an advantage, but Jack knew time wasn't on their side. Walker could wait for reinforcements while they were trapped in the canyon. It was Nayeli who spotted the way out. While the men focused on the gunfight, she had been exploring the canyon walls and found a narrow path that led up and over the rim. It was treacherous, barely wide enough for a horse, but it offered escape. "We go now," Ayanna whispered to Jack during a lull in the shooting, while they watched this place. Jack looked at the path and shook his head. "That's suicide. One slip and you'll fall 100 feet. "Better than rope," Ayanna replied simply. She was right. They led their horses carefully up the narrow trail, hearts pounding with every step. Loose rocks scattered down the cliff face, but Walker's men were too focused on the canyon entrance to notice. By the time the sheriff realized his quarry had escaped, they were already miles away, heading toward the sacred red cliffs where answers might be waiting. The red sandstone cliffs rose like ancient sentinels from the desert floor, their weathered faces telling stories that stretched back countless generations. Jack Morrison and the Apache sisters had been riding for 2 days, stopping only to rest their exhausted horses and grab a few hours of sleep in whatever shade they could find. The sun blazed overhead as they finally reached the base of the towering rock formations. Ayanna led them along a winding path that seemed invisible to Jack's eyes, but she followed it with the confidence of someone who had walked these trails since childhood. The way grew steeper and more treacherous as they climbed higher into the cliffs, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses carefully along narrow ledges. "There," Ayanna said, pointing to what looked like a crack in the rock face, "the sacred place of our ancestors." To Jack, it appeared to be nothing more than a shadow on the canyon wall, but as they drew closer, he could see it was actually the entrance to a cave system, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines and twisted juniper trees. The opening was large enough for horses to pass through, though they had to duck low to avoid the rocky ceiling. Inside, the cave opened into a vast chamber lit by shafts of sunlight, filtering through holes in the ceiling high above. The walls were covered with ancient paintings depicting hunting scenes, spiritual ceremonies, and symbols whose meaning had been lost to time. Water dripped steadily from somewhere deeper in the cave system, creating small pools that reflected the dancing patterns of light and shadow. "This place is old," Nayeli whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "Very old. Our grandmother brought us here when we were children to teach us the old ways." Jack whistled softly as he took in the magnitude of the chamber. The cave extended far back into the cliff face, with passages branching off in several directions. It was the perfect hiding place, hidden, defensible, and large enough to shelter a small army. As they unsaddled their horses and made camp near one of the fresh water pools, Jack noticed that they weren't the first recent visitors to the cave. There were signs of recent use, ashes from cook fires, areas where the ground had been cleared for sleeping, and most telling of all, the remains of supplies that hadn't been there long enough to collect dust. "Someone's been using this place," he said to Ayanna. "Recently," she nodded, her expression troubled. "Yes, we saw the signs too. But this is sacred ground. Who would dare?" Her words were cut off by the sound of approaching horses from outside the cave. Jack drew his pistol and motioned for the sisters to take cover behind some fallen rocks. Through the cave entrance, he could see riders approaching, 3 men on horseback, moving with the confidence of people who knew where they were going. The lead rider was a well-dressed man in his 50s, with silver hair and a carefully trimmed beard. He wore expensive clothes and rode a magnificent black stallion that was worth more than most men made in a year. Behind him rode 2 rough-looking characters who had the appearance of hired guns. "Well, well," the silver-haired man said as he dismounted outside the cave. "It seems our sacred sanctuary has been discovered." Jack recognized the voice immediately. Judge Harrison, the man who had insisted on proper procedure for the hanging, who had seemed like the voice of reason in Mesa Ridge. But something was very wrong with this picture. The judge and his men entered the cave, and Jack could see the shock on their faces when they spotted the camp and the 3 horses. The judge's hand moved to the gun on his hip, but he stopped when Jack stepped out from behind the rocks with his pistol drawn. "Judge Harrison," Jack said, his voice level and calm. "Funny place to find a respectable judge." Harrison's surprise quickly gave way to a cold smile. "Mr. Morrison, I must say I'm impressed. Not many men could have broken those girls out of Walker's jail and made it this far, so you know who I am." "Oh yes, I make it my business to know about men like you. Jack Morrison, former Army scout, wanted in 3 territories for various misunderstandings with the law. A man of considerable skill and questionable morals." Jack kept his gun trained on the judge while noting the positions of the other 2 men. "And what about your morals, Judge? What's a pillar of the community doing in a hidden Apache cave?" Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You really don't understand, do you? This cave isn't just a hiding place, it's the key to everything. The key to the richest silver strike this territory has ever seen." The pieces began falling into place in Jack's mind. "Silver? The entire mountain is riddled with it," Harrison said, gesturing toward the cave walls. "Veins of pure silver running through the rock like rivers of liquid wealth. But there's a problem. This is sacred Apache land. As long as the Indians have any claim to it, we can't mine it. So you decided to eliminate their claim," Jack said, "starting with 2 innocent girls." "Innocent?" Harrison scoffed. "Those girls know about the silver. Their grandmother was one of the tribal elders who refused our offers to purchase the land. When she died last month, we thought the problem was solved. But then these 2 started asking questions, poking around where they didn't belong." Ayanna stepped out from behind the rocks, her face blazing with anger. "You killed our grandmother!" "The old woman died of natural causes," Harrison replied dismissively. "But she was stubborn like all her people. She refused to understand that progress can't be stopped." Jack's finger tightened on the trigger. "So you framed them for horse stealing?" "Walker's idea, actually. Crude but effective. A public hanging would send a message to the rest of the tribe. Accept our offers or face the consequences. But you had to play the hero and ruin everything." One of Harrison's men was slowly reaching for his gun, but Jack caught the movement and shifted his aim slightly. "I wouldn't. You're outnumbered, Morrison," Harrison said. "And even if you kill us, there are others who know about the silver. The mine will be built whether you stop us or not." "Maybe," Jack replied, "but you won't live to see it." Before anyone could move, the sound of many horses approaching echoed from outside the cave. Harrison's face went pale as he realized what it meant. A moment later, the cave entrance darkened as Apache warriors on horseback appeared, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready. The leader of the war party was an older man with gray streaks in his long black hair and eyes like chips of obsidian. He spoke rapidly in Apache to Ayanna, who responded in the same language. Jack caught enough words to understand that this was her uncle, a war chief named Manuelito. and that he had been tracking them since they left Mesa Ridge. "My uncle says to tell you that you are a man of honor," Ayanna translated for Jack. "He offers you safe passage from this place." Jack nodded his thanks but kept his gun on Harrison. "What about them?" Ayanna spoke again with her uncle, then turned back to Jack. "He says the white men who defile sacred ground and murder Apache children must face Apache justice." Harrison's composure finally cracked. "You can't let them kill us. I'm a federal judge. There'll be consequences. The only consequence," Jack said, "is that your silver mine dies with you." But he was wrong about that. As the Apache warriors closed in on Harrison and his men, Jack realized that stopping these particular villains was only the beginning. The silver was still there waiting in the mountains, and there would always be other men willing to kill for it. The real fight was just beginning. The Apache warriors had Judge Harrison and his men bound with rawhide ropes, but Jack Morrison knew that killing them in the sacred cave would solve nothing. Dead men couldn't reveal the full extent of the conspiracy that threatened the Apache people. He needed answers, and he needed them before more innocent blood was shed. "Tell your uncle to wait," Jack said to Ayanna. "These men know things we need to hear." Manuelito studied Jack with calculating eyes before nodding slowly. The war chief understood the wisdom of gathering information before taking revenge. He spoke sharply to his warriors, who lowered their weapons but remained ready to strike at a moment's notice. Jack holstered his pistol and approached Harrison, who sat with his back against the cave wall, his expensive clothes now torn and dirty. The judge's arrogant demeanor had crumbled, replaced by the desperate look of a man facing his own mortality. "You mentioned others who know about the silver," Jack said. "Who?" Harrison remained silent, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. One of his hired guns, a scarred man named Pete, was less resolute. "Tell him, Judge," Pete said, his voice shaking. "Maybe if we cooperate, they'll let us live." "Shut up. You fool," Harrison snapped. Jack turned to Pete. "You want to live to see another sunrise? You better start talking." Pete looked back and forth between Harrison's glare and the Apache warriors' painted faces. Self-preservation won out. "There's a whole group of them," he said quickly. "Rich men from back east, railroad barons, mining company owners. They've been buying up land all through the territory, pushing out anyone who gets in their way." "How many?" "Maybe 20-30 men. They call themselves the Western Development Syndicate. Harrison here is just their local representative." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge or even one silver mine. It was about a systematic campaign to steal Apache land across the entire territory. "Where are they based?" "Phoenix," Pete replied. "They've got an office there, legal documents, government connections. Hell, half the territorial legislature is in their pocket." Harrison finally spoke, his voice bitter with defeat. "You think you've won something, Morrison? You've barely scratched the surface. Kill me and they'll send 10 more men to take my place. The Apache can't fight the tide of progress forever." "We'll see about that," Jack said. He turned to Ayanna. "Ask your uncle if he knows about other Apache being driven from their lands recently." Ayanna translated the question, and Manuelito's response was long and angry. When he finished, she turned back to Jack with tears in her eyes. "He says yes. Many families have been forced to leave their homes in the past year. Some were accused of crimes they didn't commit, like us. Others were simply told their land now belonged to white men with pieces of paper. Those who refused to leave were killed or disappeared." The picture was becoming clearer and more horrifying. The Western Development Syndicate wasn't just stealing land. They were conducting a campaign of ethnic cleansing, using the legal system and outright violence to drive the Apache from their ancestral homes. "There's more," Pete continued, eager to save his own skin. "They've got men in the army, too. Colonel Bradley at Fort Huachuca is one of them. Anytime the Apache try to fight back, he sends troops to restore order. Makes it look official, you know." Jack's hands clenched into fists. He'd served under men like Bradley during his army days. Officers who saw Native Americans as obstacles to be removed rather than people with rights. The corruption ran deeper than he'd imagined. Nayeli, who had been silent through most of the interrogation, suddenly spoke up in rapid Apache. Manuelito's eyes widened and he questioned her urgently. When she finished speaking, the war chief's face was like thunder. "What did she say?" Jack asked. Ayanna's voice was barely a whisper. "She remembers now. The night before we were arrested, we saw men coming out of the desert with wagons. They were taking rocks from the sacred mountain, loading them in boxes. We thought they were just travelers, but now you know they were testing the silver deposits, Jack finished. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Harrison laughed bitterly. Clever girls. Too clever for their own good. If they'd kept their mouths shut, they might have lived. Manuelito spoke again, and this time his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Ayana translated, "My uncle says the time for hiding is over. He will send runners to all the Apache bands, telling them what has happened here. If the white men want war, they will have war." Jack shook his head. War is what they want. Open conflict will give them an excuse to bring in the army and finish what they started. You'll be fighting the United States government, not just a few corrupt businessmen. Then what do you suggest? Ayana asked. Jack thought for a moment, studying the ancient cave paintings on the walls around them. The Apache had survived in this harsh land for centuries by being smart as well as brave. They needed to be smart now. We need proof, he said finally. Evidence that will expose the conspiracy and turn public opinion against the syndicate. Documents, witnesses, something that even the territorial governor can't ignore. And how do we get that? We go to Phoenix, Jack replied. We find their office and get the evidence we need. Harrison started laughing again, a sound that echoed strangely in the vast cave. You're insane, Morrison. Phoenix is crawling with their men. You'd never make it within a mile of that office. Maybe, Jack said, but I have advantages they don't expect. He looked at the Apache warriors, at the two brave sisters who had risked everything for justice, and at the sacred cave that held the secret of their people's wealth. A plan was forming in his mind, dangerous but possible. I'm going to need help, he said to Manuelito through Ayana, and I'm going to need some of your best warriors. The war chief listened as Ayana translated Jack's request, then nodded slowly. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries of Apache resistance. My uncle says the old ways and the new ways must work together, Ayana translated. He will give you warriors, but only if you promise to strike at the heart of our enemies, not just their servants. Jack extended his hand to the Apache war chief. I promise. But first we need to get to Phoenix alive, and that's going to be the easy part. Outside the cave, the desert sun was setting, painting the sky the color of blood. Soon the real battle would begin. Phoenix sprawled across the desert valley like a mirage made real, its adobe buildings and wooden structures baking under the relentless Arizona sun. Jack Morrison crouched on a ridge overlooking the territorial capital, studying the town through a spyglass while Ayana lay beside him, equally focused on the scene below. They had been watching for 3 hours, mapping the locations of guards, identifying patrol patterns, and searching for the headquarters of the Western Development Syndicate. The journey to Phoenix had taken 5 days of hard riding across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the territory. Manuelito had given Jack 4 of his best warriors, men who could move through the desert like ghosts and strike without warning. They had left Nayeli in the safety of the sacred caves with the rest of the war party, along with the captured judge, Harrison and his men, who would serve as insurance against betrayal. There, Ayana said softly, pointing toward a large brick building near the center of town. The man in the gray suit just went inside, third one today, wearing expensive clothes and carrying a leather case. Jack adjusted the spyglass and focused on the building. It was 3 stories tall, newer and more substantial than most of the structures in Phoenix. A brass plaque beside the front door caught the afternoon sunlight, and Jack could just make out the words Western Development Syndicate engraved on its surface. That's it, he said. Now we need to find a way inside. The building was well guarded, with armed men stationed at both the front and rear entrances. More concerning were the men Jack had spotted on nearby rooftops, positioned to watch for trouble. The syndicate wasn't taking any chances with security. As they watched, a freight wagon pulled up to the rear of the building. 2 men began unloading wooden crates marked with mining company logos, carrying them into what appeared to be a basement entrance. Jack smiled grimly. Every fortress had a weak spot, and he thought he'd just found theirs. That evening, as the desert sky turned purple and the first stars appeared, Jack met with the Apache warriors in a dry creek bed outside of town. The 4 men were seasoned fighters, each with scars that told stories of previous battles. Their leader was a lean, intense man named Chado, whose English was better than the others. We have watched the building, Chado reported. Many guards, but they change every 4 hours. The weak time is just before dawn, when the night guards are tired and the day guards have not yet arrived. Jack nodded. He'd observed the same pattern. What about that basement entrance? 2 guards, but they drink. We saw them passing a bottle back and forth. By midnight, they will be careless. Good. Here's what we'll do. Jack drew a rough map, in the sand with a stick, marking the locations of guards and escape routes. Chato, you and one man create a distraction on the east side of town. Nothing too dramatic. A small fire in an empty building, maybe some broken windows. Enough to draw attention and pull some of the guards away. He pointed to another spot on his crude map. The rest of us will go in through the basement. Ayanna and I will find their office and look for documents while you 2 keep watch. If things go wrong, we meet back at the old mine shaft 5 miles north of town. Ayanna studied the plan, then looked up at Jack. What if we don't find what we're looking for? Then we improvise, Jack replied. But according to Harrison's friend Pete, they keep records of everything. Bribes paid, land acquisitions, correspondence with their eastern backers. Men like that can't resist documenting their crimes. The hours passed slowly as they waited for the right moment. Jack cleaned his weapons and checked his equipment while the Apache warriors prepared for battle in their traditional way, painting their faces and offering prayers to their ancestors. Ayanna sat apart from the group, her thoughts clearly on her sister and the danger they all faced. Second thoughts? Jack asked, settling down beside her. Many thoughts, she replied. My grandmother used to say that the spirits of this land would protect our people, but they require courage from us first. Tonight we will find out if she was right. At 2 o'clock in the morning they moved out. The town was dark and quiet, with only a few lanterns burning in saloon windows and the occasional bark of a dog breaking the silence. They approached the syndicate building from the rear, staying in the shadows of adjacent structures. The 2 guards at the basement entrance were exactly as Chato had predicted, drunk and careless. One was snoring in his chair while the other stared blearily at a deck of playing cards. Jack and one of the Apache warriors slipped up behind them, and within seconds both guards were unconscious and bound with their own belts. The basement door was locked, but Jack had learned a thing or two about opening doors during his wandering years. The lock clicked open under his ministrations, and they slipped inside. The basement was filled with wooden crates and mining equipment, but more importantly, Jack could see light coming from under a door at the far end of the room. They climbed a narrow staircase and found themselves in a hallway lined with office doors. Most were dark, but one showed light beneath the door and the sound of voices from within. Jack pressed his ear to the wood and listened. Final shipment of silver ore samples arrived this afternoon, a man was saying. The assayer's report confirms what we suspected. The Apache lands contain enough silver to make us all wealthy beyond measure. Excellent, replied another voice, one Jack recognized. It was Colonel Bradley from Fort Huachuca, the Army officer Pete had mentioned. How soon can we begin full-scale mining operations? Once we clear out the remaining Apache families, the first man said. Harrison was supposed to handle that, but we've lost contact with him. If he's failed, we may need to take more direct action. Jack had heard enough. He motioned for Ayanna and the warriors to take positions, then quietly tried the door handle. It was unlocked, a stroke of luck that spoke to the syndicate's overconfidence. Jack burst through the door with his gun drawn, the Apache warriors flanking him. Inside he found 5 men gathered around a large table covered with maps and documents. Colonel Bradley was there, along with a well-dressed civilian who was obviously the syndicate's local leader, and 3 other men who looked like hired muscle. Gentlemen, Jack said pleasantly, I believe you have something that belongs to the Apache people. Bradley reached for his sidearm, but froze when he found himself looking down the barrel of Jack's Colt. The other men raised their hands slowly, clearly recognizing that they were outnumbered and outgunned. Jack Morrison, Bradley said through gritted teeth. I should have known you'd turn up in the middle of this. Always happy to disappoint you, Colonel, Jack replied. Now, I believe you were discussing your plans to steal Apache land. Mind if I take a look at those documents? Ayanna moved to the table and began gathering up the papers, her eyes widening as she read. Jack, she said urgently, this is worse than we thought. They're planning to drive out Apache families from 6 different reservations. And look at this. Payment records for territorial officials, army officers, even federal judges. Jack whistled softly as he scanned the documents. The corruption was breathtaking in its scope. The Western Development Syndicate had bought and paid for half the government officials in the territory. This evidence should be enough to bring down your entire operation, Jack said to Bradley. The colonel's face was red with rage. You'll never live to use it. Even if you escape this building, we have men throughout the territory. You're dead men walking. We'll see about that, Jack replied. But even as he spoke, he could hear commotion from outside the building. Shouts, running feet, the sound of weapons being readied. Someone had discovered their presence. Chato appeared in the doorway. We must go, he said urgently. Many men coming. The distraction failed. Jack gathered up as many documents as he could carry and stuffed them into his coat. The evidence they'd found was damning, but it would be worthless if they didn't survive to use it. Time to leave, gentlemen, he said to the captured syndicate members. But don't worry, we'll be back. As they prepared to fight their way out of the building, Jack realized that getting the evidence was only half the battle. Now they had to get it to someone who could use it, someone beyond the reach of the syndicate's corruption. The real fight was just beginning. Gunfire erupted through the Phoenix night as Jack Morrison and his Apache allies shot their way out of the Western Development Syndicate building. The stolen documents were tucked safely inside Jack's coat, but getting them to safety would require every ounce of skill and courage they possessed. The syndicate's men had surrounded the building, turning the streets into a deadly maze of crossfire and ambush points. Chato led them through a side window onto a second-story roof, then across a series of connected buildings toward the edge of town. Behind them, Colonel Bradley's voice could be heard shouting orders to his men, promising a substantial reward for Jack's capture or death. The corrupt officer had too much at stake to let them escape with evidence of his crimes. This way, Ayanna whispered, pointing toward a church steeple that rose above the surrounding buildings. If we can reach the bell tower, we'll have a view of the whole town and a better chance of finding an escape route. They moved silently across the adobe rooftops, their moccasined feet making no sound on the clay tiles. The Apache warriors seemed to flow like shadows through the darkness, centuries of survival instincts guiding their movements. Jack followed their lead, trusting their expertise in moving unseen through hostile territory. The bell tower proved to be exactly what they needed. From its height, they could see the entire layout of Phoenix spread below them like a map. More importantly, they could see the positions of the syndicate's men and identify the gaps in their perimeter. There, one of the Apache warriors said, pointing toward the north edge of town, the horse corral. If we can reach it, we can take fresh mounts and outdistance any pursuit. Jack studied the route through his spyglass. It was risky. They'd have to cross 2 main streets where they'd be exposed to gunfire, but it was their best chance. The alternative was to hole up in the church and fight a siege they couldn't win. We'll split up, Jack decided. Chato, take your men and circle around to the west. When you hear the church bell ring 3 times, create a distraction near the saloon district. That should draw their attention long enough for Ayanna and me to reach the horses. The plan was desperate, but it was all they had. As the Apache warriors disappeared into the darkness, Jack and Ayanna made their way down from the bell tower and prepared for their dash across the town. The documents in Jack's coat felt heavier than lead, weighted with the hopes of an entire people. The church bell tolled once, twice, 3 times. Immediately, the sound of breaking glass and shouting erupted from the western side of Phoenix as Chato's men went to work. Jack and Ayanna sprinted from the church doorway, racing through the shadows toward their destination. They almost made it undetected. They were within 50 yards of the horse corral when a sentry spotted them and raised the alarm. Gunfire erupted around them as they dove behind a water trough, bullets splintering the wood and sending up fountains of dirty water. We're pinned down, Ayanna said, checking her rifle. There are too many of them. Jack counted at least 8 men positioned between them and the horses, with more arriving every minute. But as he watched, he noticed something that gave him hope. The Apache warriors had done more than create a distraction. They had set fire to the syndicate building itself. Flames were already climbing the walls, and men were running with buckets of water to fight the blaze. The fire's spreading, he told Ayanna. They'll have to choose between catching us and saving their headquarters. For a moment, it looked like greed would win out. The syndicate men maintained their positions, apparently willing to let the building burn if it meant capturing the evidence. But then someone shouted that the flames were threatening the bank next door, and half the men ran to help fight the fire. Jack and Ayanna made their move, racing the final distance to the horse corral under cover of the chaos. They quickly saddled 2 of the strongest horses they could find, and mounted up just as Chato and his warriors arrived. Having fought their way through the burning town, the escape from Phoenix was a running battle that lasted until dawn. The syndicate's men pursued them relentlessly, led by Colonel Bradley himself on a magnificent cavalry mount. But the Apache warriors knew every inch of the desert, leading their pursuers into box canyons and across terrain that favored the defenders. By the time the sun rose over the Sonoran Desert, they had put 20 miles between themselves and Phoenix. Their horses were exhausted, but they were alive and still in possession of the crucial documents. "Where do we go now?" Ayanna asked as they rested in the shade of a massive saguaro cactus. Jack had been thinking about that question all night. The evidence they carried was damning, but it would be worthless if they couldn't get it to someone with the power and integrity to act on it. Most of the territorial government was corrupt, bought and paid for by the syndicate. "Tucson," he said finally. "There's a newspaper editor there named Samuel Peterson. He's one of the few honest men left in this territory, and he has connections back east. If anyone can get this story out, it's him." The journey to Tucson took 3 days of hard riding through some of the harshest country in the Southwest. They were pursued constantly, not just by Bradley's men but by bounty hunters attracted by the substantial reward the syndicate had placed on their heads. But the Apache warriors' knowledge of the land kept them one step ahead of their enemies. When they finally reached Tucson, Jack was surprised to find Samuel Peterson waiting for them at his newspaper office. The editor was a small, intense man with ink-stained fingers and the fierce eyes of someone who had dedicated his life to exposing the truth. "Mr. Morrison," Peterson said as they entered his office, "word of your adventures has reached us. Several Apache runners arrived yesterday with news of what you've discovered." Jack pulled the documents from his coat and spread them across Peterson's desk. The editor's eyes widened as he read, his expression growing more horrified with each page. "My God," Peterson whispered. "This goes all the way to Washington. Senators, congressmen, federal judges, they've bought them all, and can you use it?" Ayanna asked. Peterson nodded grimly. "Oh yes. I have contacts at newspapers in New York, Chicago, San Francisco. This story will be front-page news from coast to coast. The syndicate won't be able to hide from this kind of exposure." Within hours, Peterson's printing press was running at full capacity, producing copies of a special edition that would shake the territory to its foundations. The headline read, "Conspiracy Exposed, Government Officials Caught in Land Theft Scheme." But even as the newspapers rolled off the press, Jack knew their work wasn't finished. The syndicate wouldn't go quietly, and there would be attempts at revenge. More importantly, the Apache people needed to be protected while the legal system slowly ground toward justice. "What happens now?" Ayanna asked as they prepared to leave Tucson. "Now we go back to your people and prepare them for what's coming," Jack replied. "The syndicate will try to strike back before the government can act. We need to be ready." As they rode out of Tucson with the morning sun at their backs, Jack thought about the long road that had brought him to this point. He had started as a wandering man with no particular purpose, but somewhere along the way, he had found something worth fighting for. The Apache sisters who had been condemned to hang were now free, their names cleared by the evidence they had helped gather. The corrupt officials who had planned to steal their people's land were facing exposure and disgrace. It wasn't complete justice, that would take time, but it was a beginning. In the distance, the sacred red cliffs rose like a promise against the desert sky. The silver was still there, waiting in the mountains, but now it would remain in Apache hands where it belonged. The syndicate's dreams of easy wealth had turned to ashes, just like their headquarters in Phoenix. As they rode toward those distant cliffs, Jack Morrison smiled. He was still a wanderer, but now he was a wanderer with purpose, and in the vast expanse of the Sonoran Desert, that made all the difference.